The bullet tore through Eleanor Zimmer's wedding veil just as the preacher opened his mouth to begin the ceremony, and she watched in frozen horror as her groom collapsed at the altar with blood blooming across his white shirt. The year was 1879, and Alamosa, Colorado had seen its share of violence, but nothing quite like this, nothing quite so calculated and cruel. Eleanor's scream died in her throat as chaos erupted in the little chapel. Guests diving for cover while her father rushed toward the fallen man who was supposed to become her husband within minutes. She stood paralyzed in her ivory dress, the one she had sewn by hand over 3 long months, watching as the town doctor pronounced Martin Whitley dead before they could even loosen his collar. The shooter was never found. The marshal questioned everyone, searched every building, followed every lead that dried up like creek beds in August. Eleanor moved through the following weeks like a ghost, accepting condolences she barely heard, nodding when people spoke to her, existing but not living. Martin had been her childhood sweetheart, the son of the family that owned the mercantile next to her father's blacksmith shop. Their marriage had been planned since they were 15. Expected by everyone who knew them, as natural as seasons changing. Now he was gone, buried in the hillside cemetery overlooking the San Luis Valley, and Eleanor was left with questions that had no answers and a future that had vanished in a single gunshot. 3 months after the funeral, her father sat her down at their kitchen table with the look of a man about to deliver news he wished he did not have to share. Robert Zimmer was a broad-shouldered man, with hands scarred from decades of metalwork, and Eleanor had never seen him cry until the day they buried Martin. Now his eyes were dry but sad as he reached across the table to take her hand. "Eleanor, sweetheart, I have to tell you something," he began, his voice rough. "I'm sick. Doc Patterson says it's in my lungs, probably from all those years breathing in smoke from the forge. He gives me maybe 6 months, probably less." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her. "Papa, no. There has to be something they can do, some treatment." "There is not," he said gently but firmly. "I have made my peace with it, but I need to know you will be taken care of when I'm gone. The shop, the house, everything goes to you, but a woman alone in this town, especially with what happened to Martin, I worry about you." "I can take care of myself," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked conviction. She was 22 years old and had never lived anywhere but Alamosa, never been anywhere but this small town pressed against the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Her father squeezed her hand. "I know you are strong. You are stronger than you think. But I also know how people talk, how they look at you now. Like you are cursed somehow, like tragedy follows you. It is not true, but perception matters in a small town." Eleanor pulled her hand away, standing abruptly to look out the window at the mountains that had bounded her entire existence. "What would you have me do? Leave?" "Maybe," her father said quietly, "or maybe stay and build something new. I do not have the answers, Eleanor girl. I just want you to know that whatever you choose, you have my blessing, and you have my love, always." He died 4 months later in early spring of 1880, and Eleanor buried him next to her mother, who had passed when Eleanor was just 8 years old. She stood at the graveside in a black dress that was becoming far too familiar, listening to words about dust and ashes, and wondered if perhaps her father had been right about the curse. 2 people she loved, gone within a year. The town looked at her with a mixture of pity and superstitious unease, as though death itself walked in her shadow. The blacksmith shop passed to her, along with the small house behind it and what little money her father had saved. Eleanor knew nothing about blacksmithing, but she knew she could not run the business alone, and she could not afford to hire someone to do it for her. She posted a notice in the general store and the saloon, advertising for a blacksmith willing to work for room and board plus a percentage of the profits. Days passed with no responses, then a week, then 2. Eleanor began to accept that she would have to sell the shop, sell the house, and figure out what came next with whatever money that brought her. She was sweeping the front steps of the shop on a warm April morning when a tall figure on a dusty horse rode up and dismounted, with the easy grace of someone who spent more time in the saddle than on foot. The man was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that needed cutting. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, denim and leather worn soft with use, and he removed his hat as he approached her. "Madam," he said, his voice a low drawl that spoke of somewhere farther south, maybe Texas or Oklahoma territory. "I saw your notice about needing a blacksmith. Name's Augustus McKinley, but folks call me Gus. I am looking for work." Eleanor studied him, noting the way he met her eyes directly but not aggressively, the calloused hands that spoke of hard labor, the horse behind him that was well cared for despite the dust of travel. "Do you have experience with blacksmithing, Mr. McKinley?" "I do, madam. Learned from my uncle back in San Antonio. Worked a forge for 3 years before I took to cowboying. Still know my way around an anvil and can shoe a horse blindfolded if I need to." "Why did you leave San Antonio?" Eleanor asked, a question that might have been too direct, but she had learned that directness saved time and heartache both. Gus's jaw tightened slightly. "My uncle died, and his son inherited the business. We did not see eye to eye on much of anything, and I decided it was time to move on. I have been drifting for about 2 years now, taking work where I can find it. Ready to settle somewhere for a while." "The pay is not much," Eleanor warned him. "Room and board in the house, and 20% of whatever the shop makes. Business has been slow since my father died." "That is more than fair, madam. I do not need much, just honest work and a place to lay my head." Eleanor considered. She did not have many options, and something about Augustus McKinley seemed steady and trustworthy in a way that mattered. "All right. There is a spare room in the house, and the shop has all the tools and equipment you should need. I cannot work the forge myself, but I can manage the books and the customers. We can try this arrangement for a month and see how it suits us both." "That sounds fine, madam." He extended his hand, and Eleanor shook it, feeling the roughness of his palm against hers. "My name is Eleanor Zimmer. You can call me Eleanor. Madam makes me feel like I'm 40 years old." For the first time, a hint of a smile touched his features. "Eleanor, then. Pleased to meet you properly." Augustus moved into the spare room that afternoon, bringing with him a single saddlebag of belongings and a bedroll that had seen better days. Eleanor showed him the shop, the equipment her father had accumulated over 30 years of business, the orders that still needed fulfilling. He listened carefully, asked good questions, and by evening had the forge fired up and was working on a set of hinges that had been promised to the church for over a month. Eleanor watched him work from the doorway, mesmerized by the rhythm of hammer on hot metal, the way he moved with practiced confidence, the concentration on his face as he shaped iron into something useful. When he finally set down the hammer and plunged the finished hinges into the water barrel with a hiss of steam, she brought him a cup of water and a plate of the stew she had made for dinner. "You are good at this," she said simply. "Thank you. Your father had fine equipment and kept it well. That makes the work easier." They ate dinner at the kitchen table, a meal that was quiet but not uncomfortable. Augustus did not pry into her past, and Eleanor did not press him about his. They were two people who had found themselves in the same place, needing what the other could offer, and for now that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and Augustus proved to be as skilled as he claimed. Word spread that the Zimmer blacksmith shop was operational again, and customers began returning with work that ranged from simple horseshoes to complex metalwork for the expanding railroad that was pushing through the valley. Eleanor managed the front of the business, taking orders and collecting payment, while Augustus worked the forge from dawn until dusk. They developed an easy partnership, professional and efficient, speaking when necessary but comfortable with silence when words were not needed. But Eleanor found herself noticing things about Augustus that had nothing to do with business. The way he was unfailingly polite to everyone who came through the shop, even the customers who were rude or demanding. How he always saved the burnt edges of the bread she made because he knew she liked the middle pieces better. The gentleness with which he handled the stray cat that had taken up residence in the shop, speaking softly to it while he worked. Small things. Unremarkable perhaps, but they accumulated in her awareness like coins in a jar. One evening in early June, they were eating dinner when Augustus said, "Tell me about what happened. If you want to, I mean. I've heard whispers around town, but I would rather hear the truth from you." Eleanor set down her fork, considering whether she was ready to speak about it. She had not talked about Martin's death, not really, not beyond the bare facts that everyone already knew. But something about the quiet way Augustus asked without pushiness or morbid curiosity made her want to answer. "I was supposed to get married," she began slowly, "to Martin Whitley. We had known each other our whole lives, and everyone expected us to marry. The wedding was set for February last year. We were standing at the altar when someone shot him, killed him right there in front of everyone. They never found who did it or why." Augustus was silent for a long moment. "That is a terrible thing to survive. I am sorry. And then my father got sick and died 4 months ago, so yes, people in town think I am cursed or unlucky or some such nonsense. I see how they look at me sometimes, like they are afraid to get too close in case whatever darkness follows me touches them too." "That is foolishness," Augustus said firmly. "You did not cause those things to happen. Bad luck is just bad luck, not some kind of judgment or curse." "I know that in my head," Eleanor admitted, "but sometimes in my heart I wonder." "Well, I do not wonder," he said, his gray eyes steady on hers. "I see a woman who has lost more than anyone should have to lose and is still standing, still getting up every morning and running a business and making terrible bread that burns on the edges." Despite herself, Eleanor laughed. "My bread is not that terrible." "It is pretty terrible," he said, but he was smiling. "But I eat it anyway because you make it, and that counts for something." Something shifted between them that evening. Some invisible line that had kept them carefully professional was crossed. They began talking more, sharing pieces of their pasts in the quiet hours after the shop closed. Augustus told her about growing up in San Antonio, about his parents who had died in a yellow fever outbreak when he was 17, about the uncle who had taught him a trade and then drank himself to death 5 years later. Eleanor told him about her mother, dead too young, about her father's devotion to his craft, about Martin, and the life she had imagined that never came to be. "Do you think you loved him?" Augustus asked one night as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. Eleanor thought about that. "I do not know. I thought I did. But it was such an expected thing, such a settled thing, that I never really questioned it. We were going to get married because that is what everyone assumed would happen. Maybe we would have grown to love each other deeply, or maybe we would have just been comfortable together. I will never know now." "Do you wish you did know?" "Sometimes. Other times I think maybe it is better this way. I know that is a terrible thing to say about someone who died. It is not terrible, it is honest." Augustus was quiet for a moment, then added, "I was engaged once. Girl named Sarah back in San Antonio. She broke it off when my uncle died because she did not want to marry someone without steady prospects. Said she needed security more than she needed me. That must have hurt." "It did at the time. Now I think maybe she did me a favor. I would not be here otherwise, and this is a good place to be." Eleanor felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "I am glad you are here." "So am I," he said, and the way he looked at her made something warm unfold inside her ribcage. Summer came to the San Luis Valley with its characteristic intensity, hot days cooled by mountain breezes and afternoon thunderstorms that rolled across the peaks with dramatic fury. The shop stayed busy, and Eleanor and Augustus fell into rhythms that felt almost like a dance, anticipating each other's needs, working together with increasing ease. Eleanor found herself smiling more, laughing at Augustus's dry observations about customers, looking forward to the evenings they spent together talking about nothing and everything. It was in mid-July when she admitted to herself that what she felt for Augustus McKinley had grown beyond simple appreciation or friendship. She was falling in love with him, had perhaps been falling for weeks without naming it. The realization terrified her. She had already lost so much, already been marked by tragedy in ways that made the town regard her with suspicion. What if loving Augustus brought him harm? What if her bad luck, curse, or coincidence followed him the way it seemed to have followed everyone else she cared about? She tried to pull back, to re-establish the professional distance that had existed when he first arrived. But Augustus noticed, of course he noticed, and one evening after dinner he asked her directly what was wrong. "Nothing is wrong," Eleanor said, not meeting his eyes. "Eleanor." He said her name like a statement of fact. "You have barely spoken to me in 3 days except about shop business. If I have done something to offend you, I need to know what it is so I can fix it. You have not done anything wrong." She stood up from the table, pacing to the window. "It is me. It is this stupid fear I cannot shake." "What fear?" She turned to face him, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "That everyone I care about dies, Augustus. My mother when I was a child, Martin at the altar, my father just months ago. What if it is not coincidence? What if there is something wrong with me, something that brings death to the people I love? I cannot." Her voice broke. "I cannot lose anyone else. I cannot survive it again." Augustus stood and crossed to her, moving slowly like he was approaching a spooked horse. "Eleanor, look at me." When she did, he continued, "You do not bring death to anyone. That is grief talking and guilt, and all the weight you have been carrying alone for too long. Bad things happen to people you loved. That does not mean you caused them. But what if? There is no what if. Life is dangerous, Eleanor. People die. Sometimes for reasons that make sense and sometimes for no reason at all. You cannot protect yourself from loss by refusing to care about anyone. That is not living. That is just hiding." "I do not know if I am brave enough to risk it," she whispered. Augustus raised his hand slowly, telegraphing the movement, and gently brushed a strand of hair back from her face. "I think you are the bravest person I have ever met. You have been through hell and you are still here, still fighting. That takes a kind of courage most people never have to find." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I am falling in love with you, Augustus. That terrifies me." His expression softened into something tender and wondering. "Well, that is convenient because I'm already in love with you. Have been for weeks now. Probably since that first night when you told me my bread was not that bad and I knew you were lying to be kind." "I was not lying," she protested weakly. "You were absolutely lying." He smiled, that rare full smile that transformed his whole face. "Eleanor Zimmer, I know you are scared. I am scared too in my own way, but I would rather be scared with you than safe without you. We can figure this out together if you will let me." "What if something happens to you?" "Then something happens. But I would rather have whatever time we get together than spend my life wondering what might have been. Would not you?" Eleanor thought about Martin, about the life that had been taken before it started, about all the wondering she had done in the past year and a half. "Yes," she said finally, "yes, I would rather have the time we get." Augustus cupped her face in his calloused hands, thumbs brushing away her tears. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," she breathed, and when his lips met hers, it felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once, terrifying and perfect and right. They took their time after that, courting properly despite living in the same house, learning each other in all the ways that mattered. Augustus brought her wildflowers from the meadows beyond town, the kind that bloomed briefly and brilliantly in the high-altitude summer. Eleanor made him a new shirt to replace the one with patches on patches, stitching it carefully in the evenings while he read aloud from the newspaper. They went for walks in the cool evenings, his hand warm around hers, talking about their hopes for the shop, for the town, for the future they were beginning to build together. The town noticed, of course. People always noticed in a place as small as Alamosa. Eleanor heard the whispers, saw the looks. Some people were happy for her, said it was good to see her smiling again. Others were more skeptical, wondering if it was too soon, if she was dishonoring Martin's memory, if Augustus was taking advantage somehow. Eleanor tried not to care what anyone thought, but it wore on her nonetheless. It was Martha Henley from the general store who said something that cut through all the noise. She stopped by the shop one afternoon in August to pick up the repaired scissors Augustus had fixed for her, and she looked at Eleanor with her sharp blue eyes and said, "You look happy, girl. That is all that matters. Martin would have wanted you happy. Your papa would have wanted that too. Anyone who says different does not have your best interests at heart, and you can tell them I said so." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Martha. That means more than you know. You have been through enough grief for 3 lifetimes. Take your happiness where you find it and hold on tight. That young man of yours seems like good people." "He is," Eleanor agreed, and felt the truth of it in her bones. In early September, Augustus asked her to go riding with him on a Sunday when the shop was closed. They rode out into the valley, where the aspens were just beginning to turn gold at the higher elevations, and the air had the first crisp bite of autumn. Augustus led them to a meadow Eleanor had never seen before, surrounded by pine trees and overlooking the Sangre de Cristo range in all its jagged glory. They dismounted, and Augustus spread a blanket on the ground, laying out the lunch they had packed together that morning. They ate and talked and laughed, and when the meal was finished, Augustus took both of her hands in his. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Her heart began to beat faster. "All right. Do you think you could be happy spending your life with me? Not someday, not eventually, but starting now? Could you see yourself as my wife? Building a life together? All of it?" Eleanor felt joy and terror war in her chest. "Augustus, are you asking me to marry you?" "I am. I know it has not been that long, and I know you have reason to be cautious about marriage after what happened before, but I love you, Eleanor. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build something lasting with you, a life and maybe a family and whatever else comes our way. Will you marry me?" She looked at his face, at the hope and vulnerability there, at this good man who had come into her life when she needed him most and had stayed through her fears and grief and hesitation. She thought about Martin and the wedding that never happened, about the future that had been stolen in a single terrible moment. She thought about her father's words about building something new, about choosing to live rather than hide. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Yes, I will marry you." Augustus's face split into the biggest smile she had ever seen on him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and she felt his heart beating hard against her cheek. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this," he said into her hair. "I know you will." Eleanor pulled back to look at him. "But I need to ask something of you too." "Anything." "Can we have a simple wedding? Just us and the preacher and maybe Martha as a witness? I do not want a big ceremony or a church full of people. After what happened last time, I do not think I could bear it." Augustus's expression softened with understanding. "Whatever you want, Eleanor, we can get married in the preacher's parlor with just the 4 of us if that is what makes you comfortable. I do not care about the ceremony, I only care about you." They decided to marry at the end of September, giving themselves a few weeks to prepare and to let the news settle in the town. Eleanor told Martha, who was delighted, and immediately offered to help with whatever was needed. Augustus told the marshal, who had become a friend over the long summer months, and a few of the regular customers at the shop. The news spread quickly, as news always did, and reactions were mixed but largely positive. Eleanor spent the weeks leading up to the wedding in a state of nervous anticipation. She was happy, truly happy, but the memory of the last time she stood in a wedding dress haunted her dreams. She would wake in the night with her heart pounding, seeing again the blood spreading across white fabric, hearing the chaos and screaming. Augustus would find her in the kitchen at odd hours, drinking tea and staring at nothing. And he would sit with her without questions or judgment until she was ready to go back to bed. "What if something happens again?" she asked him one of those nights, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we will deal with it," he said steadily. "But Eleanor, lightning does not strike twice. What happened to Martin was a tragedy, a terrible random act of violence. That does not mean it will happen again. The odds of it happening again are so small they are barely worth considering. But not impossible. No, not impossible, but also not likely. We could spend our lives being afraid of what might happen, or we could choose to live despite the fear. I know which one I prefer. Eleanor leaned against his solid warmth. You make it sound so simple. It is not simple, it is terrifying, but you are worth being terrified for. The night before the wedding, Martha came to the house to help Eleanor prepare. She had found a dress in the mercantile that had been ordered but never picked up. A simple cream-colored gown with lace at the collar and cuffs. It was not the elaborate dress Eleanor had worn for Martin, and she was grateful for that. This dress was new, unmarked by tragedy, a fresh start in every sense. Martha helped her try it on, pinning and tucking where needed. You look beautiful, she said, standing back to admire the effect. That young man of yours is not going to be able to take his eyes off you. Martha, can I ask you something? Of course, dear. Do you think it is wrong that I am not more sad about Martin? I mourn him, I do, but when I think about tomorrow, I do not feel like I am betraying him. I feel like I am finally moving forward. Does that make me a terrible person? Martha turned Eleanor to face her, her expression serious. Eleanor Zimmer, you listen to me. You mourned Martin properly. You honored his memory, but you do not owe the dead your whole life. Martin is gone, and nothing you do or do not do will change that. He would want you to be happy. I knew that boy since he was in short pants, and he had a good heart. He would want you to love again and be loved. Do not let guilt steal your joy. Eleanor hugged the older woman tightly. Thank you. I needed to hear that. I know you did. Now let us get this dress fitted properly so you can marry that handsome blacksmith of yours. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cool, autumn settling into the valley with its characteristic beauty. Eleanor dressed with shaking hands, her heart beating so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The ceremony was set for 10 in the morning at Reverend Pierce's house, just the small parlor where he met with parishioners. Martha had arranged for flowers from her own garden, simple but lovely. Augustus had spent the night at the marshal's house to observe the tradition of not seeing the bride before the wedding. Eleanor was grateful for the solitude to prepare herself mentally and emotionally. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing a woman who had survived more than she ever thought she could, who was about to step into a new future with a good man who loved her. I can do this, she told her reflection. I am doing this. Martha arrived to walk with her to the Reverend's house, looping an arm through Eleanor's and patting her hand. You are shaking like a leaf, dear. I know, I cannot seem to stop. That is just nerves, perfectly natural. You will feel better once you see Augustus. The Reverend's house was a short walk from Eleanor's home, a tidy building with a garden out front. As they approached, Eleanor could see Augustus standing on the porch with Marshal Davis, both men in their best clothes. Augustus wore a new suit that actually fit him, dark gray with a vest, and he had trimmed his hair and shaved carefully. When he saw Eleanor, his whole face lit up with such pure joy that she felt some of her fear ease. He met her at the bottom of the porch steps, taking both her hands in his. You look beautiful, he said softly. Are you all right? I am terrified, she admitted, but I want this. I want you. That is all that matters. He squeezed her hands gently. Are you ready? Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling her voice shake as she nodded. Yes, let us get married before I lose my nerve. They entered the Reverend's parlor, a cozy room with afternoon light slanting through lace curtains. Reverend Pierce was an elderly man with kind eyes who had presided over Eleanor's father's funeral and had known her family for years. He smiled at them both as they took their places in front of his desk. Martha stood to one side as witness, and Marshal Davis stood to the other, both wearing expressions of genuine happiness. Reverend Pierce opened his prayer book and began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony. Eleanor tried to focus on them, on the meaning behind the ritual, but her heart was beating so loud she could barely hear. Her hands trembled in Augustus's, and she felt lightheaded with fear and anticipation mixed together. When the Reverend asked if there were any objections to the union, Eleanor flinched involuntarily, half expecting a gunshot to ring out. for history to repeat itself in the cruelest way possible. But there was only silence, warm and safe, and Augustus's hands tightened around hers in reassurance. The Reverend continued, asking Augustus if he took Eleanor to be his lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward. Augustus's voice was steady and clear as he said, "I do." Then the Reverend turned to Eleanor. "And do you, Eleanor Zimmer, take Augustus McKinley to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live?" Eleanor opened her mouth to speak and found that her voice shook so badly she could barely get the words out. "I do," she managed, the words quavering with emotion and fear and hope all tangled together. Augustus smiled at her, that gentle smile that had come to mean everything to her. He reached up to cup her face with one hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. "We will learn love together," he said quietly. Words meant just for her beneath the formal ceremony. "Every day we will learn it together, you and me." Eleanor felt tears slip down her face, but they were good tears, cleansing tears. "Together," she whispered back. Reverend Pierce pronounced them husband and wife, and Augustus kissed her gently, sweetly, a promise of the life they were beginning. Martha and the marshal clapped, and Eleanor felt something inside her chest loosen and expand, something that had been locked tight since Martin died finally opening to let in light and air and possibility. They signed the marriage certificate, making it official in the eyes of the law and the church. Martha hugged them both, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Marshal Davis shook Augustus's hand and kissed Eleanor's cheek, wishing them both happiness. Reverend Pierce blessed them and refused to take payment for the ceremony, saying it was his gift to a young couple starting their lives together. Eleanor and Augustus walked back to their house, their home now in a new way, hand in hand through the streets of Alamosa. A few people they passed offered congratulations, and if anyone looked at Eleanor with judgment or concern, she did not notice. She was aware only of Augustus beside her, solid and real, her husband now, and the future stretching before them full of unknowns that felt less frightening when faced together. That night they consummated their marriage with tenderness and a little awkwardness, learning each other's bodies the way they had been learning each other's hearts. Augustus was patient and gentle, attuned to Eleanor's nervousness, and when she cried afterward, it was from relief and release, and the sheer overwhelming reality of being truly married, truly joined to another person in all the ways that mattered. "I love you," she told him in the darkness, her head on his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "I love you too," he said, his hand stroking through her hair. "We are going to have a good life, Eleanor. I promise you that." "I believe you," she said, and found that she meant it. Autumn deepened into winter, the first snows dusting the peaks and then descending into the valley itself. The shop stayed busy with work that needed finishing before the hardest cold set in. Augustus and Eleanor worked side by side, their partnership now enriched by the intimacy of marriage, by shared mornings and evenings, by all the small domestic moments that made up a life together. Eleanor found herself happier than she could remember being, even accounting for the lingering grief she carried for her father and even for Martin. That grief was still there, would always be there in some form, but it no longer defined her entire existence. She could remember the people she had lost with love instead of only pain, could honor their memories while still building something new. In December, Martha invited them for Christmas dinner, along with several other friends they had made in town. It was a warm, joyful evening, full of good food and conversation and laughter. As Eleanor looked around the table at the faces of people who had become like family, with Augustus's hand warm in hers beneath the tablecloth, she felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. On the way home through the snowy streets, Augustus asked, "What are you thinking about? You have been quiet." "I'm thinking about how different my life is now compared to a year ago. How I never could have imagined being this happy again. Are you happy? He asked, as though he needed confirmation. Yes, she said simply. I am very happy. Are you? More than I have words for. He pulled her close as they walked, sheltering her from the wind with his body. I think we should start talking about the future, about what we want to build together. What do you mean? I mean the shop is doing well. We are making good money, better than I expected. We could expand. Maybe take on an apprentice to help with the workload. And I have been thinking about family, about children, if that is something you want. I know it might be too soon to talk about, but I want you to know it is something I hope for. Someday. Eleanor considered that. She had always assumed she would have children with Martin, but they had never discussed it in detail. It had just been one of those things that would happen eventually. With Augustus, she found herself actually wanting it, actively imagining a child with his eyes or his quiet steadiness. I would like that, she said slowly. Not immediately, maybe, but yes, I would like to have children with you. Augustus's smile was visible even in the dim light of the street lamps. Good. That is good. We have time. We have all the time we need. Winter passed into spring, and with the thaw came new growth in more ways than one. The shop continued to thrive, and they did take on an apprentice, a 17-year-old boy named Thomas, who had a good work ethic and a natural talent for the craft. This freed up some of Augustus's time and reduced the physical demands on his body, which Eleanor appreciated even though he was still young and strong. In April, Eleanor realized that her monthly courses were late, and then later, and then she knew with certainty that she was carrying Augustus's child. She told him one evening after dinner, simply and directly, and watched his face transform with wonder and joy. Truly? He asked, reaching for her. Truly, I think I'm about 2 months along, which means the baby should come in late October or early November. Augustus pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break. Eleanor, this is wonderful. This is everything I hoped for. Are you not scared? She asked, because she was terrified, thrilled, and terrified in equal measure. Of course I am scared, but mostly I am excited. We are going to be parents. The pregnancy progressed without major complications, though Eleanor dealt with morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon and a bone-deep exhaustion that made it hard to keep up with the shop work. Augustus took on more of the customer-facing responsibilities, insisting that Eleanor rest when she needed to, and Martha appointed herself as Eleanor's unofficial advisor on all things related to childbirth and babies. As Eleanor's belly grew through the summer months, she found herself marveling at the life growing inside her, at the reality of creating a person with Augustus. She felt the first flutters of movement in June, and by July the baby was kicking strongly enough that Augustus could feel it when he placed his hand on her stomach. Those moments of quiet connection, just the three of them in the evening stillness, became some of Eleanor's most treasured memories. In late October, on a cool, clear night with the stars bright overhead, Eleanor's labor began. Martha came to stay with her while Augustus paced nervously and boiled water, and generally tried to be helpful while mostly getting in the way. The labor was long and difficult, as first labors often were, lasting through the night and into the next day. Eleanor endured it with Martha's coaching and Augustus's presence, his hand in hers, his voice steady when she needed an anchor in the pain. Their son was born as the sun was setting on the second day, a healthy baby, with a strong cry and a remarkable amount of dark hair. The doctor checked him over and pronounced him perfect, then helped Eleanor deliver the afterbirth and made sure she was recovering well. Augustus held his son with shaking hands and tears running openly down his face, looking at the baby like he had never seen anything so miraculous. He is beautiful, he said, his voice choked. Eleanor, he is perfect. What should we name him? They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at her son's face, Eleanor said, I want to name him Robert, after my father, if that's all right with you. Robert is a fine name, Augustus agreed. Robert McKinley. Welcome to the world, little man. The early months of parenthood were exhausting and overwhelming and wonderful. Robert was a good baby overall. Though he had strong opinions about when he wanted to eat and be held and sleep, and those opinions did not always align with his parents' preferences. Eleanor and Augustus learned together, fumbling through diaper changes and midnight feedings and the 1,000 small crises that came with caring for an infant. The shop continued to run with Thomas taking on more responsibility and Augustus working shorter hours to help with the baby. Money was tighter than it had been, but they managed, and Eleanor found that she did not mind the sacrifices required for their growing family. She'd never been particularly interested in material wealth anyway. When Robert was 6 months old, sleeping slightly better and smiling at everything, Eleanor and Augustus had a conversation about the future. They were in bed, Robert asleep in his cradle in the corner of the room, and Eleanor was lying with her head on Augustus's chest the way she did most nights. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the shop and about our family. What about them?" "The shop is doing well enough that we could hire someone else to help run it, someone more experienced than Thomas. That would free both of us up to focus more on Robert and on any other children we might have." Augustus was quiet for a moment. "Are you saying you want more children?" "I am saying I would not mind having more children, eventually. Robert is wonderful, but I think I would like him to have siblings. What do you think?" "I think that sounds perfect," Augustus said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "How many were you thinking?" "I do not know. 2 or 3 more, maybe? Enough that they can grow up with family around them, people they can rely on." "I like that idea. We will need a bigger house eventually if we're going to have 3 or 4 children." They began planning for that future, saving money more deliberately, looking at properties on the edge of town where they could have space for children to play and maybe keep a few animals. Life settled into new rhythms, busy and full but good, better than Eleanor had ever imagined possible in those dark months after Martin's death and her father's passing. Robert grew into a curious, active toddler with his father's calm temperament and his mother's determination. When he was 2 years old, Eleanor became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. Their second son, James, was born in the summer of 1883, and where Robert had been calm, James was spirited, with opinions about everything from the moment he entered the world. They moved to the larger house when James was 6 months old, a sprawling place with room to grow and a yard where the boys could run. Augustus hired a skilled blacksmith to manage the shop most days, allowing him to work from home more often and spend time with his family. Eleanor discovered she had a talent for managing the business side of things, keeping the books and negotiating with suppliers, and between the two of them they built something successful and sustainable. When James was 2 and Robert was 4, Eleanor became pregnant a third time. She was older now, nearly 30, and this pregnancy was harder on her body. She was sick more often, tired more easily, and there were moments when she worried that something might be wrong, but the doctor assured her that everything was progressing normally, and in the spring of 1886 she gave birth to their first daughter. Margaret came into the world screaming her displeasure at having been evicted from her warm, comfortable home, and she did not stop screaming for what felt like weeks. She was a colicky baby, difficult and demanding, and Eleanor spent many long nights walking the floor with her while Augustus managed the boys in the house and tried to keep everything from falling apart. "I am sorry," Eleanor said one particularly difficult night, tears streaming down her own face while Margaret wailed, "I do not know what I am doing wrong." Augustus took the baby gently, putting her against his shoulder and swaying. "You are not doing anything wrong. Some babies are just like this. She will grow out of it." "What if she does not?" "Then we will deal with it. Eleanor, we have weathered harder things than a colicky baby. We can handle this." He was right, of course. Margaret did grow out of it, though it took nearly 4 months before she settled into a more predictable pattern. And once she calmed down, she revealed a personality that was fierce and joyful, demanding but also generous with her affection. She adored her brothers and they adored her back, doting on their baby sister with protective devotion. The years passed in the way years do when life is full and busy, marked by milestones and holidays, and the everyday moments that accumulated into a rich tapestry of family life. Robert started school and showed an aptitude for reading and mathematics. James proved to have his father's gift for working with metal and spent hours in the shop learning the trade. Margaret was the wild card, interested in everything and determined to do everything her brothers did, refusing to be left behind or treated as lesser because she was a girl. Eleanor and Augustus grew into their marriage, learning each other in all the ways that mattered. They had disagreements, of course, moments of frustration or miscommunication, but they had learned early on to talk through problems rather than let them fester. They made it a point to spend time together even as the demands of family and business pulled at them, to remember why they had chosen each other in the first place. One evening when the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch of their house watching the stars come out over the mountains. Eleanor was in her mid-30s now, and Augustus was nearing 40, and they had been married for almost 10 years. It felt both like a lifetime and like no time at all. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Eleanor asked, her hand in his. "How do you mean?" "If Martin had not died, if you had not come to Alamosa, if I had not taken a chance on hiring a stranger to run my father's shop." Augustus considered that. "I think about it sometimes, but I try not to dwell on the what-ifs. This is the life we have, and it is a good life. I am grateful for it every day." "So am I. Even the hard parts, the scary parts, I would not trade them away if it meant losing what we have built." "You know what I remember most clearly from our wedding day?" Augustus asked. "What?" "The way your voice shook when you said 'I do.' You were so scared, so brave. And I knew in that moment that I would spend the rest of my life making sure you never regretted taking that leap of faith." Eleanor leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steadiness that had been her anchor for a decade. "You have kept that promise. Every single day, you have kept that promise. And I will keep keeping it," he said simply, "until the day I die and beyond if I can manage it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the valley. Inside the house, their children slept safely. The shop was thriving, and the future stretched before them with all its uncertainty and promise. Eleanor thought about the young woman she had been, standing in a wedding dress over the body of her first fiancé, sure that her life was over before it really began. She thought about the fear that had nearly kept her from opening her heart to Augustus, the courage it had taken to say those shaking words at their wedding. She thought about everything they had learned together in the years since, all the ways they had grown and changed and built something lasting. Love was not something you found fully formed, she had learned. It was something you made day by day, choice by choice, in the big dramatic moments and in the small quiet ones that no one else ever saw. As autumn approached in 1889, Eleanor found herself feeling contemplative. Robert was nearly 9 years old, preparing to enter the upper grades at school. James was 7 and spending more time in the shop with his father, his small hands already showing the promise of skill with tools and metal. Margaret was 3, a whirlwind of energy and opinions who kept everyone on their toes. Eleanor was not planning on more children. 3 seemed like a good number, and her body had worked hard to bring those 3 into the world. But life, she had learned, did not always conform to plans, and when she realized in October that she was pregnant again, she felt a complicated mix of emotions. Augustus took the news with his characteristic steadiness, though she could see concern in his eyes. "How are you feeling about this?" "Overwhelmed," Eleanor admitted. "I am 33 years old, Augustus. I am tired. The thought of starting over with a baby when Margaret is finally sleeping through the night and becoming more independent, it is daunting." "But," he prompted, hearing the unspoken word, "but it is also ours, another piece of the life we have built, and I cannot help but feel blessed, even if I am also terrified and exhausted just thinking about it." "We will manage," Augustus said firmly. "We always do, and the children will help. Robert especially is old enough to be a real help with a baby." The pregnancy was difficult, more so than any of the others. Eleanor was sick constantly through the first few months, and by the time the sickness passed, she was dealing with swelling in her ankles and hands, and a persistent exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel monumental. Augustus took on more of the household work, and Robert and James stepped up to help with their little sister, and somehow they made it work. The baby was born in late June of 1890, a tiny daughter they named Catherine. She was the smallest of their children, born a few weeks early but healthy despite her size. Eleanor held her in exhausted wonder, marveling that her body had created this perfect little person for the fourth time. "She is our last," Eleanor told Augustus as he sat beside her hospital bed, looking at their newest daughter with the same wonder he had shown with each of their children. "I cannot do this again. My body cannot do this again." "That is fine," Augustus said gently. "4 children is a good number. We are blessed beyond measure." Catherine proved to be a sweet, easy baby, as though she knew her mother needed her to be manageable. She slept well, ate well, and seemed content to be passed from sibling to sibling, each of them eager to hold their baby sister. Margaret was initially jealous, having been the baby of the family for 3 years, but she quickly adapted and became fiercely protective of Catherine, insisting that she help with everything from diaper changes to bath time. The years that followed were full and chaotic and beautiful. Robert grew into a thoughtful young man with a love of learning and a gentle nature that reminded Eleanor of her father. James threw himself into apprenticing with Augustus, showing real talent for the craft and a work ethic that impressed everyone who dealt with him. Margaret started school and proved to be as bright and determined in the classroom as she was everywhere else, though her teachers sometimes despaired of her tendency to question everything. Catherine grew from a tiny baby into a curious toddler and then a sweet-natured little girl who seemed to get along with everyone. Augustus turned 45 in 1894, and Eleanor marked her 38th birthday that same year. They were no longer young, but they were healthy and happy, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built. The shop continued to thrive under Augustus's management and James's growing skill. They had enough money to be comfortable, to provide for their children's education and futures, to occasionally take a Sunday off and do nothing but enjoy each other's company. It was in the autumn of 1895 that Eleanor realized how far she had truly come from the terrified young woman who had stood at the altar twice, once to see her groom killed and once to marry a near stranger while shaking with fear. She was sitting on the porch with Augustus, a common evening ritual, watching their children play in the yard. Robert was 15 now, tall and lanky, helping James teach Margaret how to throw a baseball while Catherine sat in the grass making chains of wildflowers. "What are you thinking about?" Augustus asked, his arm around her shoulders. "I am thinking about how grateful I am for all of this, for you, for the life we have made. There were so many moments when I thought I would never be happy again. And look at us now." "We have been blessed," Augustus agreed. "But we also worked for this, Eleanor. We chose each other. We chose to build this life. We chose to keep choosing each other every day. That matters." "You told me on our wedding day that we would learn love together," Eleanor said softly. "I think we have done that. We are still doing it." "Every day," Augustus said, kissing her temple. "Every single day." Eleanor watched her children, these people she and Augustus had created together, and felt a bone-deep contentment. Life had not been easy, and there had been losses and fears and moments of profound difficulty, but there had also been joy beyond measure, love that grew and deepened with time, and the satisfaction of building something lasting and good. That night, after the children were in bed, Eleanor stood at the window of the bedroom she shared with Augustus and looked out at the mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. Augustus came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you looking at?" he murmured. "Everything. The mountains, the stars, our life. I am trying to memorize this moment. Why? Because I want to remember exactly how this feels, how happy I am, how loved I feel, how perfect our life is right now, even with all its imperfections." Augustus turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I love you, Eleanor McKinley. I have loved you since before I had the words to tell you, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me when I was too scared to let myself love you back. Thank you for being patient, for being kind, for being exactly who you are." "We saved each other," Augustus said simply. "You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go, and I gave you a reason to hope when you thought hope was impossible. Everything else built from there." They stood together in the quiet of their bedroom. Two people who had found each other against the odds and built a life that neither could have imagined in those early, uncertain days. Eleanor thought about the girl she had been, traumatized and grieving, sure that she was cursed. She thought about the courage it had taken to say those shaking words at their wedding, to believe that love was possible even when everything in her experience suggested otherwise. She had learned so much in the 16 years since Augustus McKinley rode into Alamosa and changed her life. She had learned that grief and joy could coexist, that love grew stronger through adversity, that building a life together meant choosing each other again and again in big ways and small. She had learned that fear was not a reason to stop living, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. Most of all, she had learned that love was not a destination you reached, but a journey you took together, learning as you went, making mistakes and fixing them, growing and changing and adapting. She and Augustus were not the same people who had stood in Reverend Pierce's parlor 16 years ago. They had been shaped by time and experience, by the children they had raised, and the challenges they had faced. But the core of what they had built remained solid and true. As 1895 turned into 1896, the McKinley family continued to flourish. Robert prepared to finish his basic education and began talking about attending college, an opportunity his parents were determined to provide even though it would mean him leaving Alamosa. James, at 14, was becoming a skilled blacksmith in his own right, talking about innovations in metalwork and new techniques he wanted to try. Margaret, at 10, was a force of nature, excelling in school and organizing her siblings and generally running the household with more efficiency than anyone twice her age. Catherine, at nearly 6, was the sweet center of their family, the one who could calm tensions and make everyone laugh. Eleanor and Augustus watched their children grow with pride and some bittersweet awareness that their time of all being under one roof was limited, but they tried to savor each day, to be present for the moments that mattered, to remember that this too was part of the journey they were taking together. On their 16th wedding anniversary, Augustus surprised Eleanor by taking her back to the meadow where he had proposed. It was a warm September day, the aspens golden and the air crisp with the promise of autumn. They rode out together, just the two of them, leaving the children in Martha's capable care for the afternoon. When they reached the meadow, Augustus spread the same blanket they had used all those years ago, somehow preserved through 16 years of family life. They sat together, eating the lunch they had packed, talking about their children and their hopes for the future. "Do you ever regret it?" Augustus asked, a question he had asked in various forms over the years. "Regret what? Marrying you?" "Any of it. The fear you had to overcome, the life you gave up when Martin died, any of the hard parts." Eleanor looked at him, this man who had become her whole world, and shook her head. "No, not for a single moment. This life, our life, it is more than I ever dreamed was possible. You gave me that, Augustus. You and our children, you gave me a reason to believe in happiness again." "You gave me the same thing," he said softly. "I was drifting before I found you, just moving from place to place without any real purpose. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to stay and build something that matters." They made love there in the meadow, under the vast blue Colorado sky, with the freedom and passion of people who knew each other completely and loved each other fiercely. Afterward, lying in Augustus's arms, with the sun warm on her skin, Eleanor felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "We have a good life," she said. "We have the best life," Augustus corrected, and Eleanor laughed because it was true. The years continued to pass, marked by milestones and celebrations. Robert left for college in Denver in 1897, and Eleanor cried for a week despite being proud of him. James took over more of the shop work. officially becoming Augustus's partner on his 18th birthday. Margaret shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to become a teacher, a profession that required training and education, but that suited her perfectly. Catherine started school and proved to have inherited her father's artistic eye and steady hands, spending hours drawing and painting. Augustus's hair turned gray at the temples and then fully silver, and Eleanor found she loved him with gray hair as much as she had when it was brown. Her own hair showed streaks of white, and there were lines around her eyes and mouth from years of smiling, and she wore them with pride because they were evidence of a life well lived. In 1900, as the new century dawned, the McKinley family gathered for a photograph, something that was becoming more common but still felt special and significant. They dressed in their best clothes and went to the photographer's studio in town, arranging themselves according to the photographer's instructions. Augustus and Eleanor sat in the center, with Robert and James standing behind them, and Margaret and Catherine on either side. The photographer disappeared beneath his black cloth, and they held still while he captured the image that would preserve this moment forever. Looking at the developed photograph later, Eleanor marveled at what she saw. A family. Her family. People who loved each other and supported each other and had been built through choice and effort and the thousands of small decisions that added up to a life. She saw Augustus beside her, still handsome to her eyes despite the years and the gray hair and the lines time had etched into his face. She saw her children, each of them their own person, but all of them carrying pieces of her and Augustus forward into the future. "We did good," Augustus said, looking at the photograph with her. "We did very good," Eleanor agreed. Robert married in 1902, a young woman he had met at college who shared his love of learning and his gentle nature. Eleanor watched her firstborn son exchange vows and remembered her own wedding day, the fear that had nearly paralyzed her, and marveled at how different Robert's experience was. He was joyful and certain, standing at the altar without hesitation, and Eleanor was grateful that her children had been spared the kind of trauma that had marked her young adulthood. James married 2 years later, a girl from Alamosa who had known him since childhood and loved him with practical devotion. Their wedding was simple but joyful, and Eleanor and Augustus hosted the celebration at their house, proud to see their second son beginning his adult life. Margaret went off to teacher training in 1905, and Eleanor dealt with having a second child leave home with more grace than she had the first time, though it was still difficult. Catherine, at 15, suddenly found herself the only child still at home, and she adapted to the new dynamic with her characteristic sweetness, enjoying the increased attention from her parents. As Eleanor entered her 50s, she found herself reflecting more on the journey she and Augustus had taken together. They had been married for 25 years in 1905, a quarter of a century of partnership and love. They celebrated with a party that their children organized, bringing everyone home for a weekend of food and stories and laughter. At the party, Robert stood up to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught all of us what love looks like when it is real and lasting and built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. You gave us an example to live up to, and we are all better people for having been raised by you. Here is to 25 more years." Everyone cheered and drank, and Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. Augustus squeezed her hand under the table, his eyes bright with emotion. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Augustus and Eleanor sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The night was warm and clear, and Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder with a deep sense of peace. 25 years, she said softly. "Can you believe it?" "Some days it feels like a lifetime," Augustus said. "Other days it feels like we just got married yesterday. Time is strange that way." "Do you remember what you told me on our wedding day? When my voice shook so badly I could barely get the words out. I remember. I told you we would learn love together." "You were right," Eleanor said. "We have learned so much together. About love, about partnership, about building a life and a family. I could not have done any of this without you, Nif." "We did it together," Augustus said firmly. "That was the point. Neither of us had to do it alone." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had shared more than half their lives together and still had more to share. Eleanor thought about the young woman she had been, so afraid of loss that she had nearly turned away from love entirely. She was grateful that Augustus had been patient with her fear, had given her time and space to heal while still making his feelings clear. She was grateful for every choice they had made together, every challenge they had faced, every joy they had celebrated. The years that followed brought their share of changes. Catherine married in 1910, a young doctor who had come to Alamosa to practice and had immediately fallen in love with the quiet strength and artistic talent of the McKinley's youngest daughter. Margaret found success as a teacher and eventually became the headmistress of a small school, respected and admired by her students and their families. James took over the blacksmith shop entirely as Augustus began to slow down, his joints stiffening with age, and his energy not what it once was. Robert became a professor at the college in Denver, teaching mathematics and logic to eager young students. Eleanor and Augustus became grandparents, a development that delighted them both. Robert and his wife had 3 children. James and his wife had 4. And the house that had once been full of their own children became full of grandchildren on holidays and special occasions. Eleanor loved being a grandmother, loved the way it allowed her to enjoy children without the constant weight of responsibility, loved watching Augustus with their grandchildren and seeing him as patient and devoted with them as he had been with their own children. They grew old together, Augustus and Eleanor, their bodies slowing but their minds sharp, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1919, surrounded by children and grandchildren and a few friends who had been part of their lives for decades. Martha had passed away a few years earlier, but her memory was honored at the celebration. Her role in bringing them together and supporting them through the early years remembered with fondness and gratitude. Augustus was 70 years old by then, and Eleanor was 63. And they moved with the careful deliberation of people whose bodies no longer obeyed them quite as readily as they once had. But they were still themselves, still the partnership they had built across 4 decades, still learning love together in all its forms. One evening in the autumn of 1921, they sat on their porch as they had done countless times over the years. The evening was cool, and the mountains were dusted with the first snow of the season. Eleanor was wrapped in a shawl, and Augustus had a blanket over his lap, and they held hands the way they always did. "I have been thinking about our life," Eleanor said softly, "about everything we have built and experienced together." "What have you been thinking?" "That I'm so grateful for you, for our children, for every moment we have shared. My life could have gone in such a different direction after Martin died. I could have spent my whole life afraid, never taking another chance on love. But you gave me a reason to be brave." Augustus squeezed her hand gently. "You gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. You gave me a purpose and a family and a reason to stay in one place. We saved each other, Eleanor. That is what partnerships do." "Do you think we will get much more time?" Eleanor asked, a question she had been hesitant to voice, but that had been on her mind. "I do not know," Augustus said honestly. "We are both getting old, and bodies do not last forever. But however much time we get, I want to spend it with you. And when one of us goes, the other will have all these years to remember. That is not nothing." "No," Eleanor agreed. "That is definitely not nothing." They sat in silence, watching the stars come out one by one, feeling the bond between them as strong as it had ever been. They had learned love together across more than 40 years, had built something lasting and beautiful, had created a family and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Augustus McKinley died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1923, 2 weeks after his 74th birthday. Eleanor woke one morning to find him cold beside her, his face peaceful, and she knew that he had simply slipped away during the night. She sat with him for a long time, holding his hand one last time, saying goodbye to the man who had been her partner and her love for more than 40 years. The funeral was well attended, a testament to the life Augustus had lived and the people he had touched. Their children spoke about their father with love and pride, sharing stories that made people laugh and cry. Eleanor listened to it all with a kind of numb detachment, not quite able to process that Augustus was truly gone. In the days and weeks that followed, Eleanor moved through her grief with the same determination she had brought to everything else in her life. She missed Augustus with a physical ache that never quite went away, but she also carried 43 years of love and partnership with her, and that sustained her through the hardest moments. She was not alone in her grief. Her children rallied around her, making sure she was never isolated for long, visiting regularly, and bringing the grandchildren to fill the quiet house with noise and life. Eleanor lived for another 6 years after Augustus's death, long enough to see several more grandchildren born and to watch the older ones begin to marry and have children of their own. She became a great-grandmother, a title that amused her, and she spent her final years surrounded by family, telling stories about Augustus and about their life together, making sure that the lessons they had learned and the love they had shared would be passed down to future generations. She died quietly in her sleep in the autumn of 1929, just shy of her 73rd birthday. Her children found her in the morning, peaceful and still, and they buried her next to Augustus in the hillside cemetery overlooking the San Luis Valley, the same cemetery where Martin Whitley and Robert Zimmer were buried, where so much of her history rested. But Eleanor's true legacy was not in that cemetery. It was in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried pieces of her and Augustus forward into the future. It was in the love story they had lived, the example they had set, the lessons they had taught about courage and partnership and the daily work of building a life together. It was in the shop that still bore the Zimmer name but was run by James and his children, carrying on the craft that had brought Eleanor and Augustus together in the first place. Years later, one of their great-granddaughters would find the wedding photograph, the one taken in Reverend Pierce's parlor, and would look at the young couple standing there with wonder. She would see the fear in Eleanor's eyes, the steadiness in Augustus's expression, and she would understand something about courage that she had not understood before. She would learn the story of how her great-grandmother's voice had shaken when she said, "I do," and how her great-grandfather had smiled and promised they would learn love together, and she would carry that story forward to her own children and grandchildren, because that was the point, really. Not the fear or the tragedy or the hard parts, but what came after, the choice to be brave, to take a chance on love even when it was terrifying, to build something lasting one day at a time. Eleanor and Augustus McKinley had done that, had learned love together across more than 4 decades, had created a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And in the end, that was more than enough. That was everything.